The Duke of Blackwood required a hand, not a hand in marriage, for which every eligible and ineligible daughter of the peerage was being relentlessly polished, but a hand that could write. Specifically, a hand that could transcribe ledgers, copy contracts, and bring order to the archival chaos that was his late father's private study. The war effort demanded clarity from his shipping concerns, and clarity was a commodity in vanishingly short supply within the four walls of that damnable room. "Her name is Miss Elara Vance," Mr. Finch, his solicitor of 30 years, had said, his voice as dry as the parchment he so revered. Her father was a cartographer of some small note. He left her with an excellent education and precisely nothing else. Her penmanship is, by all accounts, flawless. Alistair Beaumont, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, had grunted an assent. He cared little for the woman's history, and less for her education. He cared only for the legibility of her script. He was a man concerned with results, not with the delicate inner lives of his employees. The world was a great, grinding machine, and one either found their place as a useful cog or was ground into dust. He was a very large and important part of the machine. She, if hired, would be a very small one. Now, she sat opposite him in the very study that was to be her cage. The room smelled of decaying paper and forgotten pipe tobacco. A single shaft of dusty afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating her hands, which were folded neatly in her lap. He had expected someone frail, perhaps with the ink-stained fragility of a moth. Miss Vance was not a moth. She was still, impossibly still. She was neither plain nor beautiful, occupying that unfortunate and easily dismissed territory in between. Her gray dress was immaculate but unadorned, a garment designed for the express purpose of being forgotten. Her hair was bound in a knot so severe it seemed to pull the very expression from her face, leaving behind a placid, unreadable mask. He had the distinct impression that if he were to leave the room and return, he might forget she was there at all. He slid a piece of paper and a pen across the vast, scarred surface of his mahogany desk. "A sample, if you would." The first paragraph of this article. She did not startle. She did not rush. She moved with a quiet economy, her fingers closing around the pen as if it were an extension of her own bones. She dipped it in the inkwell, a small, precise motion, and began to write. There was no sound but the delicate, rhythmic scratch of nib on paper. It was a clean sound, a sound of purpose. He watched her, not as a man watches a woman, but as an engineer watches a new piece of machinery. He observed the steady, unwavering line, the perfect uniformity of each letter. It was copperplate, but with a strength and clarity that elevated it from mere penmanship to something architectural. It was, as Finch had promised, flawless. She finished, blotted the ink with a practiced flick of the wrist, and pushed the paper back toward him. Her eyes, a shade of gray that matched her dress, met his for a fraction of a second before returning to her folded hands. In that brief glance, there was no deference, no anxiety. There was only a quiet, unnerving neutrality. He picked up the paper. The script was magnificent. Each word was a perfect little soldier standing at attention. It was the handwriting of order itself, a direct and formidable challenge to the chaos surrounding them. "You will begin on Monday," he said, his tone clipped and final. "Mr. Finch has arranged your salary. You will be provided with whatever supplies you require. Your task is to copy every document on the west wall, beginning with the red leather ledgers. You will then sort the originals chronologically." "Very good, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was like her person, quiet, clear, and leaving no impression whatsoever. The interview was over. He stood, a clear dismissal. She rose, curtsied with a precision that matched her handwriting, and was gone, escorted out by a footman. The room felt exactly as it had before she entered. It was as if she had been a ghost, leaving behind only this single, perfect sheet of paper. Later that evening, Lord Gideon Croft called upon him. Croft was a man whose appetites were as sharp as his tailoring, a creature of opportunity who thrived in the murky waters of wartime commerce. He saw Alistair's shipping interests not as a ducal duty but as a source of immense, untapped profit. They sat with glasses of brandy, the smoke from their cigars coiling in the stagnant air of the library. Alistair, in a moment of unguarded weariness, mentioned the state of his father's papers and the solution he had found. "A copyist?" Croft said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You, Blackwood, buried under paper like a country solicitor. Is she at least decorative?" Alistair swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He tried to summon Miss Vance's face to mind and found, to his slight irritation, that he could not. He remembered the stillness. He remembered the hands. He remembered the script. The woman herself was a blank. "She is a functional creature," Alistair replied, the words tasting of dismissal. "Severely dressed, entirely unmemorable. But her handwriting is all she offers, and it is exquisite, a perfect, unthinking machine of penmanship." He took a drink of his brandy. The matter concluded. He had assessed the woman, identified her function, and filed her away. He had seen all there was to see. He was, of course, profoundly wrong. On Monday, Miss Vance arrived. She did not arrive with a flurry or an announcement. She simply was. One moment, the copyist's desk in the corner of the study was empty. The next, she was seated at it, a row of sharpened quills and a fresh bottle of ink arranged before her like surgical instruments. Alistair acknowledged her with a curt nod, to which she responded with an inclination of her head so slight it was barely perceptible. He gestured toward the west wall, a teetering mountain range of vellum, parchment, and paper bound in decaying leather. "Begin," he commanded, and turned back to his own work, the woman already forgotten. The only sound for the rest of the day was the whisper of her pen, a constant soothing scratch that was infinitely less irritating than the ticking of the mantel clock. It was the sound of progress. It was the sound of chaos being tamed. At the end of the day, she departed as silently as she had arrived. On her desk sat a neat stack of copied pages, their ink dark and perfect. Beside it lay the original ledger, a silk ribbon marking her stopping point. It was exactly what he had asked for. Efficient, mechanical. The next morning, however, he noticed something else. The small pile of original documents he had consulted the day before and left in a disordered heap on the corner of his own desk was now a neat, squared stack. A slip of paper sat on top, upon which was written in that flawless script, "Correspondence, Port of Bristol, May 1810. He frowned. He had not asked her to touch the papers on his desk. It was a minor presumption, but a presumption nonetheless. He resolved to mention it. But the day grew busy, filled with meetings about tonnage and naval contracts, and he forgot. The pattern established itself. Each morning, Miss Vance would appear. Each day, she would work in absolute silence. Each evening, she would vanish, leaving behind a testament to her flawless hand. And each morning, Alistair would find some small, peripheral part of his own workspace, subtly ordered. A misfiled map returned to its proper drawer. A collection of receipts from a single voyage, bundled together with a string. A note identifying a contract he had been searching for, placed discreetly at his elbow. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. He found it vaguely unsettling. He was a man who commanded. He gave orders, and they were followed. Miss Vance followed his orders to the letter, but she also seemed to be following a set of silent, invisible orders of her own devising. She was not merely copying the chaos, she was editing it, curating it, imposing upon it a logic that he himself had failed to find. One afternoon, he was struggling with a discrepancy between a captain's log and a warehouse inventory. The numbers refused to align, a gap of several dozen barrels of French brandy unaccounted for. It was a trivial matter in the grand scheme of his finances, but it irritated him, a dissonant note in an otherwise profitable venture. He sighed in frustration, running a hand through his hair. From the corner of the room, her quiet voice emerged, startling him. "The tide tables for that week, Your Grace," she said, without looking up from her work. The neap tide was unusually low. The harbor master's supplementary report notes that several ships had to unload at the outer quay. Alistair stared at her. The back of her head was ramrod straight. Her pen had not paused in its journey across the page. How could she possibly know what he was working on? And how, in God's name, did she know about the tide tables? He had not given them to her. They were in a folio he had not opened in months. He stood and walked to the bookshelf where the naval almanacs were kept. He pulled out the correct year, found the harbor master's report, and scanned the page. There it was, an addendum about unloading at the outer quay, which used a different inventory clerk. The discrepancy was explained. He returned to his desk, the folio still in his hand. He looked at the still, gray figure in the corner. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something other than dismissive utility. It was a brief, uncomfortable recalibration of his perception. "How did you know that, Miss Vance?" he asked. She finally paused, placing her pen carefully on its rest. She turned her head, and her gray eyes met his. Again, that unnerving neutrality. "The captain's log you were reading mentioned a delay due to foul anchorage," she said, her voice even. "The date corresponded with a note on a customs receipt I copied yesterday, which was stamped with the mark of the outer quay's clerk. The tide tables were a logical corollary." She had connected 3 disparate pieces of information, one on his desk, one she had copied the day before, and one that existed only on a shelf, and synthesized them into a correct and useful conclusion. It was not the action of a machine. "I see," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you." She gave that tiny, almost imperceptible nod and turned back to her work. The scratching of the pen resumed. The moment was over, but it lingered in his mind. He had assumed her a vessel for a single, beautiful skill. It was becoming apparent that the vessel contained far more than he had accounted for. He had hired a hand, but a mind had come with it, a mind that was quiet, analytical, and alarmingly observant. He found himself watching her more often, noticing the way she would pause, her pen hovering over the page, her gaze distant, as if she were reading not just the words, but the spaces and connections between them. He did not know what to make of it. He did not know what to do with it. So he did what he always did with things that complicated his worldview. He ignored it. The inciting incident, when it came, was not a thunderclap but a quiet rustle of paper. It was an error born of arrogance and haste, a wound inflicted by a careless word committed to ink. Alistair was in correspondence with Lord Croft regarding a potential joint venture, a proposal to supply the Royal Navy with timber from his northern estates. Croft's letters were florid and flattering, full of assurances of mutual benefit, but Alistair sensed the man's rapacious greed beneath the polished surface. The negotiations were delicate. In a moment of frustration with Croft's dissembling, Alistair penned a draft of a letter. It was sharp and to the point, demanding clearer terms. As an aside, a petty flourish to reassert his own superior standing, he added a postscript regarding the general inefficiency he was forced to endure in his affairs. "The matter is further complicated," he wrote, "by the fact that I must personally oversee every detail. My new copyist, though possessing a superlative hand, is merely that. One cannot delegate thought to such a person, only the mechanical act of transcription. It is a tedious business." He read the line over, a grim satisfaction settling in him. It was a fine piece of casual condescension, a perfect echo of the dismissive sentiment he had shared with Croft over brandy. It established him as a man beset by the incompetence of his underlings, a common ground for men of their station. He left the draft on the corner of his desk with a pile of other documents to be copied. It was his habit now. He would leave a mess, and in the morning, order would have been imposed upon it. He gave the letter no further thought. It was just another piece of paper, another task for the quiet machine in the corner. Ilara saw the letter the next morning. It was placed atop the pile, the Duke's aggressive, slashing script a stark contrast to her own measured hand. Her instructions were to copy everything he left for her. She picked it up. She read the first paragraph, a coolly worded dissection of a timber contract. She read the second, a demand for transparency on shipping costs. And then she read the postscript. My new copyist, though possessing a superlative hand, is merely that. One cannot delegate thought to such a person, only the mechanical act of transcription. The words did not strike her like a blow. They landed with the cold, quiet finality of a key turning in a lock. There was no shock, no surge of anger. There was only a profound and weary confirmation of what she had always known to be true about her place in this world, and specifically, in this room. She had allowed herself a small, secret hope. The Duke had, in recent weeks, seemed to watch her. He had thanked her for the insight about the tide tables. A foolish, sentimental part of her had begun to imagine that he was starting to see past the pen to the person who held it. She had begun to offer more of herself, leaving little trails of logic for him to follow, connecting threads she knew he had missed. She had taken a quiet pride in making his work, his life, flow more smoothly. She had believed, in some small way, that her intelligence was being recognized, if not acknowledged. This letter was the correction to that fanciful notion. He had not been seeing her at all. He had been seeing a more efficient tool, a better machine. Her thoughts, her insights, were not valued. They were not even perceived as existing. She was a hand, nothing more. A door closed inside her. It was not a dramatic, slamming affair. It was a heavy oak door, settling silently into its frame, the latch clicking softly into place. It was the door to the part of herself she had so tentatively offered. She sat down at her desk. She took out a fresh sheet of paper. She dipped her pen in the ink, and with a steady hand, she copied the Duke's letter, including the postscript. Her script was, as always, flawless. Each letter was a perfect, beautiful lie, masking the cold emptiness that had settled in her heart. She finished the letter and placed it with the other copied documents. Then, she turned to the rest of the pile. She copied. She transcribed. She did exactly what she was paid to do. She did not sort the originals. She did not bundle the related receipts. She did not place a helpful note on his desk identifying the key correspondence. She simply copied the words on the pages, one after another. She had been hired for her handwriting, and from that moment forward, her handwriting was all she would offer. The change was not immediate. It was a slow erosion, the kind of decay one notices only in retrospect. Alistair, preoccupied with the Croft negotiations, did not perceive the shift for several days. He registered only a vague sense of returning friction, a loss of the effortless momentum he had grown accustomed to. He first became consciously aware of it on a Tuesday. He needed the charter agreement for the Sea Serpent, a document he had vaguely recalled seeing a week or two prior. Before, such a document would have simply appeared at his elbow, as if summoned by his unspoken need. Now, it was nowhere to be found. He spent a frustrating half-hour sifting through a disorganized pile of shipping manifests before locating it, misfiled within a sheaf of insurance claims. The small annoyance pricked at him. A few days later, he was reviewing a ledger she had copied. He found an error, a simple transposition of numbers that threw off the entire column. It was a minor thing, the kind of mistake anyone could make, but it was the first error, the first crack in the perfect facade of her work. More jarring, however, was the fact that the original ledger contained a faint pencil mark next to the very same entry, a question mark in a different, spidery hand, the old clerk's. Miss Vance had copied the error without comment, without even a subtle pencil tick of her own to draw his attention to a potential issue. She had simply transcribed. Mechanically, he looked over at her. She was bent over her desk, her posture as rigid and perfect as her script. The afternoon sun cast her in silhouette, rendering her a two-dimensional figure, a shadow defined only by its function. He began to watch her, truly watch her, for the first time, and in watching, he began to notice not her presence, but her absence. The quiet intelligence that had hummed just beneath the surface of the room was gone. The atmosphere, which had once felt charged with a silent, organizational energy, was now inert. She was in the room, but she was no longer of the room. She was an echo, a ghost at her own desk. He started to test his theory. "Miss Vance," he said one afternoon, holding up two conflicting reports. "I find a discrepancy here regarding the shipment of sailcloth." He waited. He expected her to reply with some crystalline observation, to point out a bill of lading or a customs stamp that would resolve the conflict. She did not look up. "My instructions are to copy the documents as they are written, Your Grace." The reply was perfectly polite. It was perfectly correct, and it was a blade slid neatly between his ribs. It was a verbatim recitation of his own narrow definition of her role. She was using his own words as a shield and a weapon. The unraveling accelerated. The chaos she had once held at bay began to creep back into the room, reclaiming its territory inch by inch. Piles of unsorted papers grew like sedimentary layers on every flat surface. He wasted hours searching for documents, his work slowing to a crawl. The room, which had briefly become a place of clarity and purpose, reverted to the frustrating morass it had been before her arrival. He realized, with a dawning horror, that he had not merely grown accustomed to her silent assistance, he had become dependent on it. The order she had created was not an incidental byproduct of her neatness. It was the product of an active, engaged, and superior intellect. An intellect he had dismissed as non-existent. The catalyst for his final, shattering epiphany came, as it so often does, from a third party. Mr. Finch arrived one morning to review some contracts and stood for a long moment in the doorway of the study, his gaze sweeping over the renewed disaster. "It appears the forces of entropy are winning the day once more. Your Grace," the solicitor observed, his tone bone-dry. "My copyist seems to have lost some of her organizational fervor," Alistair admitted, the words tasting like ash. Mr. Finch looked from the messy desk to the silent figure of Miss Vance in the corner, then back to the Duke. A flicker of something pity, perhaps, or disappointment crossed his aged features. "A fine pen is a valuable tool, to be sure," Finch said quietly, his words freighted with meaning. "But a keen mind is a priceless instrument. It is a great pity to use one as if it were only the other, a great pity and a great waste." The solicitor said no more, turning his attention to the contracts, but his words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. A great waste. That evening, after Miss Vance had departed, Alistair sat alone in the deepening gloom of his study. The silence she left behind was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, empty. He thought about the change. He thought about her flat, correct, dismissive answers. He thought about when, precisely, the frost had descended. His mind snagged on the correspondence with Croft. It had been around that time. On a sudden, sickening impulse, he went to his files. He pulled out the folder containing the copies of his letters. He found the one to Croft. He opened it. He stared at the postscript, copied in her perfect, elegant hand. One cannot delegate thought to such a person. He looked at the paper itself. He was a man of careless habits. When he folded a letter, he did it hastily, the creases often soft and uneven. This paper, however, was folded with an unnerving precision. The creases were as sharp as a knife's edge, perfectly aligned. It was not his fold. He had seen that same precision in the way she blotted a page, the way she arranged her quills. It was her fold. She had read it. The full weight of his colossal foolishness crashed down upon him. It was a physical sensation, a pressure in his chest that stole his breath. He saw it all in a sickening, clarifying flash. He had not hired a machine. He had hired a brilliant, perceptive woman and, through his own blind arrogance, had insulted her so profoundly that she had withdrawn every part of herself except the one single skill he had claimed was her totality. He had demanded a hand, and she, in an act of quiet, devastating rebellion, had given him only a hand. He saw the tide tables. He saw the sorted correspondence. He saw the 100 small acts of intelligence and initiative that he had accepted without comment, like a king accepting tribute. He had mistaken a gift for a service. He thought about her still, gray presence. He had called her unmemorable. He now understood that her quietness was not an absence of personality, but a carefully constructed fortress. He had stood on the outside, judging the blankness of the walls, never once suspecting the vibrant, complex life that existed within. He had not just been wrong. He had been a blind and arrogant fool, and the shame of it was a novel and exquisitely painful sensation. The next day, he knew he had to speak to her. Not to command, not to instruct, but to confess. The thought of it was daunting. He knew how to negotiate a contract, command a ship's captain, and address the House of Lords. He had no idea how to admit to a quiet woman in a gray dress that he had been fundamentally, devastatingly wrong about her very existence. He waited until the afternoon, his nerves fraying with each scratch of her pen from the corner. He could not do it here, in the room that was the site of his crime. When the mantel clock struck 4, he saw her begin her ritual of packing away her things. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice sounding rough to his own ears. "A moment of your time, if you please." In the library, she looked at him, her expression betraying nothing. She simply nodded and, when she was ready, preceded him out of the room. He found her in the West Library, a cavernous, neglected space filled with the ghosts of generations of Beaumonts. Dust motes danced in the long shafts of light slanting down from the high arched windows. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and fading ink. It was a place of silent, sleeping knowledge. She was not looking at him. She was standing before a tall shelf, her head tilted as she read the titles on the spines. Her hand was outstretched, her fingers tracing the gold leaf of a large folio, a compendium of maritime law and naval precedent. It was a book no one had opened in 50 years. He stood there for a long moment, watching her. This was her natural habitat. Not the functional desk in his study, but here, among the collected thoughts and histories of the world, he cleared his throat. "Miss Vance." She turned, her hands clasped before her. She waited. The words he had rehearsed fled him. He was left with only the raw, unvarnished truth. "I have been a fool," he began, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. A blind, arrogant, colossal fool. Her expression did not change. She did not grant him the mercy of a reaction. "I saw the letter to Lord Croft," he continued, forcing himself to meet her steady gaze. "My copy of it. I saw the fold. I know you read what I wrote." He paused, hoping for some sign, some flicker of emotion. There was nothing. It was like speaking to a statue. "What I wrote." It was an inexcusable piece of snobbery. But the greater crime was not the insult itself. The greater crime was that I actually believed it. "I looked at you, and I saw only a skill. I failed to see the intelligence, the perception, the person wielding it. I was wrong." The words "I was wrong" hung in the dusty air between them. He had never said them with such sincerity in his entire life. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not deserve it. He simply stood there, having laid his idiocy bare. He expected her to nod politely and leave. He expected a quiet, formal resignation. He did not expect her to speak. "You were," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was a simple statement of fact, as clear and cold as winter water. The blunt agreement was more devastating than any tirade. He had to change the subject, to move from his own failure to something more tangible. He took a step closer, gesturing vaguely back in the direction of his study. "This business with Lord Croft," he said, his voice low. "I have long suspected him of impropriety. I believe he is using his wartime contracts to trade with the French. War profiteering. Treason." He looked at her, truly looked at her, trying to convey the respect he had so long withheld. "The evidence, I am certain, is buried in that mountain of paper in my study. I was too blind and too disorganized to see it." "I suspect," he said, his voice dropping further. "That you were not." For the first time, something shifted in her gaze. A flicker of interest. A spark in the cool gray depths. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent assessment that felt more rigorous than any examination he had ever undergone. Then, without a word, she turned back to the bookshelf. She reached up, her fingers finding the spine of a slim, unassuming volume, bound in dark blue leather. It was a book of coastal charts. She pulled it from the shelf, opened it to a specific page, and laid it on the heavy reading table nearby. She pointed to a small, almost invisible notation in the margin of a chart depicting the Channel Islands. It was a sounding depth, recorded in a tiny, precise hand. "Lord Croft's ship, the Good Endeavour," she said, her voice devoid of all but factual certainty. "Its official manifests state it draws 20 feet of water. It consistently reports docking at St. Anne, on Alderney." She traced a line on the chart with one finger. "The harbor approach to St. Anne has a sandbar. At high tide, its maximum clearance is 18 feet. She lifted her gaze from the chart to his face. "The ship never goes to St. Anne, Your Grace," she stated simply. "It cannot." Alistair stared at the chart, then at her. The implication was staggering. The official records were a lie, a cover for the ship going somewhere else entirely, and she had deduced this from a single number in a forgotten book. This was not an apology accepted. This was a new set of terms being laid out. She would not be his copyist. She would not be his confessor. But she might, just might, be his ally. The price of her engagement was his respect, and the currency was the truth. "Show me," he said, his voice filled with a new and profound sense of awe. "Show me everything." What followed was not a forgiveness, but a renegotiation. Ilara did not smile at him. She did not unbend. The door that had closed within her remained shut, but she had opened a small, grated window and was peering out. Her assistance was contingent, her trust not yet granted. She became not his employee, but his collaborator. They did not return to the Duke's study, with its fraught history of his arrogance and her silence. Instead, the West Library became their headquarters. He ordered tables brought in, lamps lit. He had every last document from his father's study carted into the library and piled at her direction. She was the general. He was her lieutenant. "We need the cargo manifests for the Good Endeavour for the last 6 months, she would say. And he would dispatch a clerk to the main office to fetch them. Cross-reference these dates with the Admiralty reports on French privateer movements, she would instruct. And he would spend hours poring over naval dispatches until his eyes burned. He saw her now in her element, and it was breathtaking. Her mind moved through the sea of paper like a shark through water, silent, efficient, and lethal. She saw patterns he had never imagined existed. She connected a provisioner's bill from Portsmouth to an anomalous insurance premium filed in Liverpool and a chandler's receipt for an unusual quantity of Portuguese wine. Each was a single, innocuous thread, but she wove them together, and the tapestry they created was one of audacious treason. Lord Croft, she deduced, was not merely trading with the enemy. He was supplying them. His ships, under the guise of legitimate trade in the Channel Islands, were meeting French vessels in secluded coves and offloading vital supplies, British wool, naval stores, even intelligence on convoy movements gleaned from loose talk at the London docks. Their evenings were spent bent over charts and ledgers, the only light from a shared candelabrum, their heads often inches apart. In these moments, Alistair learned more about her than he had in all the weeks she had sat silently in his study. He learned of her passion for mathematics, a skill inherited from her cartographer father. He learned of her dry, biting wit, which she deployed with surgical precision when he was being slow on the uptake. "No, Your Grace," she said once, with a sigh of exquisite patience as he struggled to grasp a point about currency exchange rates. "The profit is not in the principle. It is in the arbitrage." Even a duke must understand that. He found himself not offended but delighted. He had never been spoken to with such frank, intellectual disdain. It was bracing. It was honest. It was a sign that the grated window was perhaps opening a little wider. He began to notice other things. The way a stray curl would escape her severe bun when she was deep in concentration. The way she chewed on the end of her quill when a piece of the puzzle frustrated her. The quick, intelligent light in her gray eyes when she finally found the connection she was looking for. He, who had once been unable to recall her face, now found it etched into his mind. The act of working together, of building their case against Croft brick by painstaking brick, was also the act of rebuilding the foundation between them. He stopped seeing her as an employee he had wronged and started seeing her simply as Ilara, a woman of formidable intellect, quiet courage, and a resilience that humbled him. The final piece of evidence came from an unlikely source, a letter from a disgruntled former captain of Crofts, which had been languishing in a pile of correspondence for years. Ilara found it. The captain wrote of being ordered to falsify his logs and being dismissed when he refused. He even named the location of the secret rendezvous, a small, sheltered bay on the French coast called Anse de la Trahison, Traitor's Cove. The irony was not lost on them. With this, their case was complete. It was irrefutable. "We have him," Alistair said, looking at the damning collection of evidence spread across the table. He looked at Ilara, her face illuminated by the candlelight. A profound sense of gratitude and something deeper, something warmer, washed over him. "We have him," she corrected softly, and in her eyes he saw not a victory over Croft, but a victory of her own. She had asserted her worth not through argument or accusation, but through undeniable competence. Alistair took the evidence not to his solicitor, but directly to the Home Secretary. He did not present it as his own discovery. He was meticulous in his explanation. "The work was done by Miss Ilara Vance," he stated, his voice clear and firm. "My role was merely to provide her with the necessary documents. The analysis, the connections, the discovery, they are all hers. The arrest of Lord Gideon Croft, a man of such apparent wealth and influence, sent a shockwave through the ton. The charge was treason. The evidence was absolute. He was ruined, his name destined for infamy." Alistair did not care about the scandal. His only thought was for Ilara. He returned to the library that evening to find her packing away the last of the charts. The great tables were clear. Their work was done. A sudden, cold fear gripped him. He feared that with their purpose concluded, she would simply vanish, as silently as she had arrived. "What will you do now?" he asked, the question feeling heavy and inadequate. She finished tying a ribbon around a scroll of maps before she answered. "I imagine I will seek another position, Your Grace. One where my duties are more clearly defined from the outset." The polite, formal words were a knife in his heart. He could not let her go. He could not return to a life where her mind, her presence, was not intertwined with his. "I have a different position to offer," he said, his heart pounding. He walked around the table until he stood before her. "It is a permanent position. The duties are varied. They include advising a very foolish duke, managing his chaotic estates, and occasionally reminding him of the importance of tide tables." She looked up at him, her gray eyes searching his. The mask of neutrality was gone. In its place was a cautious, questioning vulnerability. "The remuneration," he continued, his voice softer now, "includes the title of Duchess, and the unwavering, eternal respect and admiration of the man who holds the title." He reached out, his hand hesitating before gently touching her arm. "Ilara, stay." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was the first overt sign of emotion he had ever seen from her. She did not wipe it away. "The terms," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, "are acceptable." A year later, the West Library was no longer a dusty archive, nor was it a temporary war room. It was the living heart of the Blackwood estate. The lamps were always lit, the fire always burning, and the scent of old paper was now mingled with the faint, fresh scent of lemon verbena that always clung to the Duchess. Ilara, Duchess of Blackwood, sat opposite her husband at the great reading table. Before them was not a tangle of treasonous contracts, but plans for a new school on the estate. Her handwriting, still as flawless as ever, moved across the page, making annotations and calculations. Alistair was not pretending to work. He was watching her. The act of watching his wife had become his favorite pastime. He loved the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He loved the small, decisive tap of her pen when she settled on a solution. He loved the quiet, confident intelligence that radiated from her. He remembered his first foolish assessment of her. Her handwriting is all she offers. How catastrophically wrong he had been. Her handwriting had been merely the key, the elegant, deceptive cover of a book of infinite depth and complexity. He had spent the past year reading that book, and he knew he would spend the rest of his life happily turning its pages, discovering new wonders with every chapter. She looked up, as if sensing his gaze, and offered him a small, rare smile. It was a smile that lit her entire face, that made her gray eyes shine like polished silver. It was a smile meant only for him, a reward for finally learning how to see. "Is something amusing, Your Grace?" she asked, her tone light. "I was just thinking," he said, reaching across the table to place his hand over hers, stilling the perfect pen, "that I am the luckiest and most thoroughly reformed fool in all of England." Her smile widened. "A high distinction indeed," she said, "but one I am inclined to agree with." Her hand turned under his, her fingers lacing with his own. They sat there for a long moment, in the quiet, shared harmony of their library, a duke and his duchess, a man and his wife, two minds and two hearts that had found their perfect, logical corollary in one another. The chaos of the world could rage outside, but within these walls, they had created their own impeccable, unassailable order. It was an order built not on the perfection of a single hand, but on the profound, restorative power of being truly, finally, seen.